Now, since we are discussing the concept of property in the African cultures, I think it would be appropriate for us to define what we mean by culture. Culture may be taken to mean the intrinsic value of society. By intrinsic, I mean that culture has value in itself. It's not like money, for example. As you know, money is just pieces of paper. If tomorrow the government declared that it is no longer legal tender, you would just throw it away. So it is there only because it is a means of exchange, maybe a store of value, but it has no intrinsic value in itself. On the other hand, culture has this intrinsic value. It encompasses the concepts, habits, skills, art, institutions, instruments, etc., of a given people at a given period. Indeed, on examining the African cultures, we discover that in fact they have not been static. They have evolved over the years, and they have been influenced by a conglomeration of other cultures, especially those from the Western world which colonized Africa. In fact, the entire history of the African continent has been one of change. And in thinking about African cultures, we need to have an awareness of the many changes they have undergone. But the question is it possible to speak of an African culture? There has been a lot of debate on whether an African culture really exists. Some people argue that there is no such a thing as an African culture because Africa, the second largest continent with an area of about 12 million square miles, has so many tribes, ethnic groups or communities with different cultures, customs, characteristic spirit, ethics, modes of life, languages. Take languages, for example. Africa has more than 800 of them. Just imagine, it has a population of over 500 million people fragmented into more than 50 nations. In fact, some people allege that Africa is the most fragmented of all the continents. Then, how can one speak of an African culture? To quote a certain professor by the name of 𝐜𝐴𝐤𝐸, another myth is that all African cultures are basically alike, while it is true that there are elements common to the social life of the many African groups. There are also differences. And yet, despite the differences, from the survey conducted by the different zones of the Focolare movement in Africa, and from research, it is evident that with regard to property, there are certain common aspects in many of the African cultures. To quote a certain scholar by the name of Batten in his book, Problems of African Development, in Africa, it is possible to distinguish some traditional ideas about land which are common in nearly every tribal society. Elliot P. Skinner, a renowned scholar, observes in his book entitled Peoples and Cultures of Africa that the very shape of Africa is a question mark. I remember when we were learning history that many years ago, they used to say that Africa was the dark continent. And you could see that Africa was a continent often misunderstood. So Elliot P. Skinner says that the very shape of Africa is a question mark and challenges scholars to find the proper key to an understanding of its rich diversity and complexity. Partly to meet this challenge, which has been posed by so many others before and after, but above all, to gain understanding of the concept of property in African societies, the information I'm about to share with you was gathered from the various zones of the Focolare movement in sub-Saharan Africa. In addition, various scholars and personalities were interviewed, apart from information extracted from books written by renowned researchers, professors, writers, and African leaders, most of whom led their countries to independence. African leaders, for example, had common aspirations such as unification, liberation, and social justice. And in their outlook, they tended to look at what was common in Africa and at times bordered on treating Africa as one. In fact, very often they talk about African culture in the singular. Despite the fact that there are many forms of property, the focal point of my discussion will be land as a source of material ownership. But why land? Because on examining property, there is no other form of material ownership that surpasses land. In fact, Simpson S.R., a renowned scholar, affirms, land is a source of all material ownership. From it we get everything we use of value, whether it be food, clothing, fuel, shelter, metal, or precious stones. The availability of land is key to human existence, and its distribution and use are of vital importance. In fact, it is true that while man can survive without other forms of property, it is impossible for him to survive without land. Moreover, most of the economies from which Africans originate are agricultural economies, where the importance of land cannot be overemphasized. To avoid confusion, it is important to point out that in our discussion, when we talk about ownership, we shall not talk about it in the European sense, where one has the right to possess, use, and above all, dispose of some at will. Instead, we shall speak of the right a person has over the land he holds, subject to limitations by laws made by the community or state. That way, we neutralize the argument that there was no real ownership of land in Africa, since it could not be disposed of at will, and in some communities, it was even considered sacred. For example, from the survey done by the zone of Fontem, land assumed a sacred nature in the Bangwa tradition, where it was seen as having been given by God. In our discussion, we shall also underline land as a donation or inherited from generation to generation, rather than a result of work or labor. But we also know that despite the above emphasis, property and work are inextricably bound, because property is a result of work or labor. What an erudite writer, 𝐭𝐴 says in his book, Ghana and Land Law, says is true, that a human being's talents and energy indeed can take him far, and his achievement is much affected by what he makes on the land he lives on. This fact was borne out by the traditional African societies. People did not wait for things to be handed to them on a silver platter. They worked, and those who worked became rich. They were able to enjoy a better standard of living, for example, in form of housing, feeding. They were able to acquire more domestic animals and other forms of property. Although emphasis has been placed on cultivation of land as a means of survival, there were pastoral communities which depended on their animals for subsistence: cattle, sheep, goats, chicken, camels. Cattle, for example, were taken as value and a status symbol. The more the animals, the richer. Even up to today, the 𝐭𝐚𝐥𝐿 of Uganda and the Maasai of Kenya, for example, cattle are wealth, and money is not attractive enough compared to their animals. They are not only a means of survival, but a means of social fulfillment and personal gratification. In fact, the 𝐭𝐴 described a rich man as a man of stock, as a man of cattle. Then you are talking, you are rich. Whether one discusses their economy, their social ties, their marriage practices, their dancing, song, or poetry, cattle enter as a significant and sometimes dominant feature. A close look at the traditional African societies reveals that they were generally communitarian societies. To quote 𝐜𝐨𝐨𝐤𝐲 in a book edited by Ali Mazrui and Hansu Patel, strong emphasis was placed on work and cooperative enterprise, on unity and friendship. In fact, some former African leaders described African societies as follows. Léopold Senghor, renowned writer and former president of Senegal, as communal. Julius Nyerere, former president of Tanzania, as extended family. Sékou Touré, former president of Guinea-Conakry, as communocratic. Kwame Nkrumah, former president of Ghana, goes further and talks about a collective spirit. So while an individual was allowed to play a meaningful role, central emphasis was placed on the community and had no place for selfish individualism. For example, among the Fante of Ghana, collective responsibility and cooperation are outstanding attributes of the clan, and several proverbs attest to this expected pattern of behavior. In fact, one of the proverbs goes that the poor kinsman does not lack a resting place.